Hello and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and welcome to a very special 1 year anniversary show. Randall, we have now been on the show together. We've had the show for a year.
Yeah, this is the 52nd episode, which makes it a year, right? That's how we're counting.
52 weeks in a year. Hey, folks, if you want to celebrate with us, please, as always, like, share, subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with us, Randall, what's the best way?
We'll check out our website, chrisandrandall.com. There's links to just about everywhere our show is on there. And our Facebook page is a good way to write a comment.
Excellent. Well, again, it's our 1 year anniversary show, and I realize I guess we're both a podcast if you're listening, and we're what they call a vlogcast if you're watching, which is just another version of podcast, but with the letter V. For those of you who are just listening, I made the V sign with my hands. Anyway, we have covered to a certain degree video and Facebook and variations on vlogcast. But, Randall, it's dawned on me that we actually have never done an episode on the arts and entertainment as podcasting, which is very funny since we are, in fact, podcasters. And most of you right now are listening because you're into podcasting. So of all the various things that we've covered, somehow we've ignored the very activity most of you listeners are doing. And it's interesting because podcasting is now more popular than ever. Randall, can I read you some very dry statistics?
Yes.
That people love to hear, dry statistics. So according to the 2021 edition of the Infinite Dial study, over 55% of the U.S. population have listened to a podcast. In 2020, over 155 million people listen to a podcast every week. Isn't that amazing?
That's a lot of people.
I didn't know that. Did you know that?
No, I didn't think it was so many.
I mean, they say about 68 million people listen to multiple podcasts a week, and that podcast listeners consume an average of 7 different shows per week. So many of you right now listening to us, you're really into podcasting, and you're listening to 7 different shows a week. And you got a lot to choose from because you know how many competitors we have, Randall?
How many?
We have 700,000 active podcasts with 29 million episodes available.
That's a lot.
So I got to say right now, if you have your choice between me and 700,000 other shows, and this one episode out of 29 million episodes available, thank you. The most popular age group, this I should have seen coming. What do you think is the most popular age group? It's a 20-year age bracket, if that'll help you.
I don't know. What is it, Chris?
It is 25 to 44. You guys make up half of all total listeners. You youngest of the Gen Xers, eldest of the millennials to the youngest of the millennials. Can you be 25 and a millennial, or does that put you in Gen Z or something?
I don't know.
I don't know either.
I think you're still a millennial.
Okay, well.
But millennials and Gen Z, I like to call them by a more accurate name, echo boomers.
Echo boomers. Hey, we love you all. And hey, Randall, even you are just slightly older than the average viewer. That said, I know because I've looked at our statistics, that we tend to skew a little bit older. Actually, quite a lot of our audience members, when I looked it up, are in between their early 40s to mid 50s. So kind of around the ages we are. So we tend to skew just a little bit older. But still, that's a large, healthy part of the population. The most popular podcast app is Spotify. Did you know that?
That surprises me. I would have thought it was the Apple app.
Well, the Apple app is
second.
number 2. And just literally as we were working on this episode, Apple announced yesterday they're going to do a pay subscription app where you get special episodes and early releases and a lot of goodies for a certain amount of months. And then if you and I want to be platformed there, we only have to spend $20 and I guess provide them with special goodies. But
Yeah, the Apple Podcast app was the first podcasting app. I mean, that's where podcasts started, and so it's no surprise that that was like the number one podcast app for most of the time, for the longest time. But yeah, Spotify becoming. So you're on Spotify, right, Chris?
I'm on Spotify, and by the way, some of you right now are listening to us on Spotify, and some of you are listening to us on the Apple Podcast app. And if you're worried that we're going to make a second tier that's going to require you to give your hard-earned money, no. We're only going to give you our best work free of charge. Is that right, Randall?
Yeah, I've never liked the pay model with media personally. Let me ask you though, Chris. So you're on Spotify. Yeah. You use Spotify. Why do you think Spotify is so big with podcasts? Do you have an opinion?
No. I mean, I think in fairness, both Apple and Spotify, if you're looking at recommendation. Well, Spotify is good with recommendations, but I just read that the new Apple platform is going to steal kind of Spotify's magic and start recommending, if you like this, you'll also like that. I mean, that is Spotify's best ability, is they can kind of figure out what you like and find something else for you to like, which is kind of why they're doing well. And it's kind of why Apple's still doing their thunder. Did you know that 28% of the U.S. population, or 80 million listeners, can now be considered habitual weekly podcast listeners, and that is up 5% from last year. Oops. And podcast familiarity is also up 5% from last year. Podcast listenership is up from 5% last year. Somehow, in the pandemic year of 2020, more people now than ever are listening to podcasts. Normally at home, about half, and then another third in their cars, and then another group, about 10% on their headphones while working out, and then another bunch of people in various other ways, I guess. Very unclear how. So, yeah, you were going to say something. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was just gonna say, yeah, it's nice. It's probably because of the pandemic year. That's all I was gonna say.
Well,
it's one of the factors that's going on here.
I will say that podcasts have been trending ever since about 2015, and they're becoming increasingly popular. They certainly picked up a lot in this past pandemic year, and we're going to talk a lot about why we think podcasts. That's really the theme of the show today: is why. Why now? Why are podcasts so popular? What are they supplanting? What makes them different? What makes them the replacement? But before we talk about now, let's go back. Randall, take us through the origins and the history of the podcast.
Well, the podcast is an interesting emergent format. It was a combination of a couple different things. I mean, it all starts with I want to say push notifications, or RSS, really simple syndication. The whole notion.
What year would that be?
Geez, I'm not sure. Like, we're talking like late 90s, maybe.
Well, I had heard that it began in the early 80s as
well, there were people that started doing like radio shows, shall we say, audio shows, and they would post them online. But the whole idea of the podcast was that it would leverage RSS, and RSS, the word feed, like Facebook has now like sort of stolen the word feed, but the word feed was first used to describe what you'd get with RSS. So the idea was, okay, you have all these websites, and what happens when somebody updates their website? Like, let's say you have a blog. Somebody puts up a new blog post. How would you ever know they put up a new blog post unless you went to their page? Well, you solve that problem with something called RSS, the feed. So the idea is you get an application, an RSS feed reader, that shows you all the updates on your favorite websites. And then somebody got the idea, well, why don't we do audio posts too? And then somebody could see an audio post in their feed. And then Apple Podcasts came out. or Apple iPods came out, is what I should say. Apple iPod. And for all the
Oh,
young
I remember
kids,
those. Yeah.
yeah, for all the young kids, it's like iPods don't
Like
even exist anymore.
2001, something like that.
Yeah, so the iPod was um, an MP3 player, and MP3s were kind of revolutionary because they were a compression format for audio that that took a lot of audio and put it into a tiny space, and the sound quality was still very good. So you could fit like hundreds and thousands of songs on a little tiny device. And Apple came out with the iPod, and that became the most popular MP3 player. And so now you have the iPod, you have this idea of the RSS feed, and you have people able to record audio on their computer and compress it into an MP3 format. And so somebody came up with the idea, hey, let's make it so that you can turn on your iPod and it'll automatically download your favorite audio shows, the newest episodes of your favorite audio shows. And that's why they're called podcasts, because it started with the Apple iPod. And by the way, the iPod doesn't exist anymore because Apple, years later, basically invented the smartphone with the iPhone. And the whole idea behind the smartphone at the time, and all the new kids, all the kids aren't going to know this, but the idea, the idea behind the smartphone was people were carrying around their MP3 player, the iPod, and a phone. And this wasn't a smartphone yet. It was just like a very normal cell phone where you could maybe text, and you mostly talked on it. And people were saying, hey, why doesn't somebody combine the MP3 player and the cell phone? Because now I wouldn't have to carry around two devices. I just carry around one device. And Apple did it, and it became the iPhone. And Apple had the bright idea of putting like a touch screen on it so that, and, the early iPhones didn't have that much functionality. So now smartphones today are like, like almost like full-fledged computers. But, the early smartphones weren't like that. So that's where the podcast comes from. It's kind of like just a whole convergence of different technologies coming together. And, I think, because I watched the rise of it, I think that a lot of it is people who, especially radio people, were interested in getting their content out to as many people as possible, and also like not having to deal with gatekeepers. So there were a lot of early radio DJs, I remember, who started podcasts in the beginning because they could start their own show and make it on their home computer and send it direct out to people and not have to worry about any kind of censorship, any kind of corporate involvement, and, they could bypass everybody. And, that whole idea of podcasts being low barrier to entry and anybody can make one and then send it out to the world and list it on a podcast site, that still exists. I mean, that's what we do.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in a bit. But
and I'll just say one more thing. So because of the open nature of podcasts, where you have people making their own audio feed, making a feed of their audio content, and then making that feed public, and allowing anybody to take that feed and download their content for free. You have these things, podcast aggregators, which are just like websites, like Apple's a podcast aggregator, Spotify. They just take all these free podcasts and they put them together in a catalog and make them available for people to find.
Well, also you have networks that now have gotten into it, and a network will be anything from a company that, like Gideon, for example, is one that I'm thinking of, where they will underwrite a show, they will produce a show, or they will be the company that represents the show and gets them landed on different platforms. So you really kind of have like two different kinds of podcasts now. You have those that are on the blank network, whatever that network might be, though strangely enough, even those networks are now getting purchased by Spotify and Apple. So we don't know how long these middlemen networks are going to last. We are not on one of them right now. Obviously, we'd love to be because they would pay us money and they would get us to more places. So
Well,
if you happen to be listening and you're one of those networks, please pick us up.
well, so far, I'd just like to say that most of the podcast aggregators, they have maintained the open nature that started from the beginning, and they don't really have much censorship of the kind of podcast they're aggregating. And I'm kind of surprised by that. I always thought that it would eventually change at some point in the future. But so far, I mean, this is why there's so many podcasts, because anybody can start one and it gets aggregated in one of these services. And
so we've addressed why, and we'll get back into it a little bit later, maybe why they are easy to make. But we'll get more into the nuts and bolts, I promise, folks, later. But really, the question is, why have they become so popular? Because a lot of things are easy to do. Not everything's popular. Now, it's a weird deal because I think that certainly something that caught my eye back in 2015, 2014, when I wasn't myself very much into podcasts at all, is when Barack Obama was president of the United States, and he had given a podcast in some stand-up comics garage in Los Angeles. Marc Maron has a show. I hadn't watched it at the time, called WTF, which, as you just say, it's things that you can say, which is short for what the fuck. And the president of the United States was doing a podcast there. And I thought to myself, what's going on? What's that about? When was the first time that you really started to notice podcasts?
Well, I was okay. I noticed podcasts from the very beginning because I was actually interested in the RSS technology, because I was making websites, and RSS was an exciting new technology at the time it was developed and invented and dreamed up, and podcasts came later to piggyback off of RSS. And so, I watched podcasts from the very beginning. And I thought like a lot of people that RSS was the most important technology there, but I don't know if RSS has really had much of an influence now. I mean,
Well,
I think news sites
think
still use it and podcasts still use it, but the whole idea of RSS, it's kind of like social media is kind of like taken over the whole push notification arena.
Well, that's a really good point. And, I think, Randall, you really are identifying that you and I really represent two of the opposite kinds of audience members. Those people who are early adapters, who are into social media, are into alternative media, and are into these cutting edge things like yourself. And then, just here's the deal with me. Okay. For years, even before I had a smartphone, even before I had an MP3 player, I had a cassette recorder with a radio, and I loved listening to NPR whenever I was commuting to work or anywhere. And I would just listen to NPR. And you and I used to even listen to NPR on your car radio when we first met. And at some point, NPR started having a website where instead of, having to listen to NPR live, I could go to the website and I could pick and choose which stories I wanted to hear. And this was fascinating to me because, kind of like reading a newspaper on the internet, you may not want to hear everything, or you might want to get to certain stories before you get to other stories. So just the interactivity and the connectivity of it all really, really started to work for me.
Yeah,
And,
I totally agree. I know that the whole thing with the internet is you could pick and choose your content, and it's so weird to go back to traditional TV where you just have to turn the channel and you have to wait. You have to hope that they show you something you're interested in. I mean, it's so weird to me that there's all these like streaming TV watching services now where like Pluto, for instance, where they are trying to recreate the television experience by giving you channels where you can't control the content. I mean, why would you want that?
I don't know. And I will say that
it feels
I was
primitive.
already a Spotify listener, and I enjoyed listening to music on Spotify. But when I started to see that Spotify had podcasts, and it had podcasts about things like music, or it had podcasts by NPR, a station with people. I mean, even if it was something as simple as Fresh Air, which is a show I had already been listening to prior to being a podcast, it was an easy entry in. And I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell and his books, and he has dedicated a lot of his career now putting out really fascinating podcasts. So I'd say by around 2017, which is maybe 4 years ago now, 2018, I was really starting to get into the scene. But I got rid of my Spotify when the pandemic started last year because I wasn't really in cars that often. I wasn't commuting that often. And I didn't really expect that I'd be listening to podcasts more. And I think there's three reasons why podcasts have been very easy right now. We've talked about at least the popularity, as you said, of the rise in platforms, the ease of access. But I also think that on a listener's end, a lot of us are alone these days. And we used to want to have the TV on to keep us company. But there's something even more intimate, I think, about hearing another person's voice or several people's voices. I think if you're working from home and you don't have to share your office space, you might enjoy you could play it on loud. You don't have to have your headphones on, or you could have your headphones on. But I think it fills the environment. I know a number of people I've asked this question to, and it feels like there's people who listen to podcasts actively and they stop what they're doing. I'm definitely one of those myself, probably from years of commuting. And there's other people I know who like to just listen to it passively. They just want to have it on the background. Oh my God, that means somebody right now is doing their dishes while listening to us.
I like to listen to this stuff while doing my dishes.
Do you? Yeah.
You know what? I don't think that's passive listening though. I think that when you're doing something boring, okay, like doing the dishes, you can devote attention to the podcast you're listening to. I mean, I really do think that. I listen to podcasts and books on tape and stuff, audiobooks when I'm doing the dishes, and I think that's some of my most active listening actually during those times.
Put down your dishes and listen to this part, okay? Because this part's important, all right? You can just, this is going to take a few minutes and you can go back to passively listening. But one of the things I want to get across is also in our era now of isolation and social distancing, you can also produce, you can put together these shows without having to be in a shared space. If you and I, Randall, were recording a TV show or a radio show, there's a strong possibility we'd have to be in the same room. But I have to say that Randall and I, even though it looks the same because of our mutual backgrounds, we're not even in the same place. In fact, in the year that we have put this podcast together, I think I have only seen you in person once.
Well, I think Zoom really opened the door to doing certain kind of podcasts because there's a lot of technical problems with recording a podcast in person, and Zoom solves a lot of those problems. I mean, just the logistics of getting people in the same place at the same time is like a large hurdle.
It is, and therefore it makes it a lot easier for one person to be in one place and another person to be in another place. And you just see that if you're watching, you just see the two cameras of us next to each other. And if you're listening, how are you going to know that Randall and I have not literally spent any time together? It sounds like we're in the same room, except for when I talk, or, thanks to your audio. And I think maybe those are kinds of the reasons why it is now taking up more and more of our entertainment time. Look, I think that I've identified who does podcast competing with? What is it aiming to replace? What is it challenging? And I would say it's challenging for the most part, radio, pretty obviously, TV to a certain extent, newspapers and magazines, and even to a certain degree, audiobooks. So let's break it down And I'd say, like, I think the biggest difference between radio, for example, the most obvious, and podcasting is that radio is live. Because both of, wouldn't you say that's one of those things? I mean, do I guess some people podcast live, or is that?
Yeah, some
Not
people
true.
podcast live, like live online. I
Over there, I
actually,
was wrong. I was wrong. But well, how is it similar to and different than radio, you think?
well, even people that do it live online, I mean, it's not the same, I mean, on the old radio live call-in shows, which was always fun. People could call in, they could talk to you. You'd have to have somebody screen the calls, so keep the show moving. When people do live online, there's nobody calling in. They're writing comments in the chat.
No, there actually are. I mean, there are some call-in shows, but you're right. For the most part,
There's a few, but they
it
don't
is,
really.
as you say, as you say, most of it really is that they're writing live comments in chat.
YouTube does something that's interesting. They have something, I think it's called a super chat, where you pay some money and you can have your text comment highlighted. And some people that do these live shows, they will only respond to the paid comments. And that actually, it seems to work. Because there's a lot fewer paid comments. You don't have like a forum full of people that's just scrolling past, at light speed. And I mean, how do you figure out what to respond to in that situation? You can't.
Also, I think when you're thinking about radio, it tends to be a little bit more uniform. Everything on a radio station, we're the conservative radio station, we're the progressive radio station, we're the all sports radio station. The DJs aren't faceless, but they all seem to wear a similar suit. Whereas I do feel like personalities, which can be distinct in radio, don't get me wrong, or can be even more distinct in a podcast where it's not even part of a network. There is really no morning zoo in podcasting.
Well, it's because it's one of the. I guess it's a difference, shall we say, with radio is like they're definitely on at a specific time, broadcasting to a specific audience. So they're really trying to fill time and keep that audience listening during that time.
Well, that's a very good point. And I think it's really, and I'll open this up to TV, because I feel like in many ways TV and radio are almost identical in this way. And if you look at an interview show on radio or an interview show on TV, and I've done interview shows on radio and television, so I'm pretty familiar with the format, and you do an interview show, say on a podcast, if a show is taped, for example, let's say you're watching Late Night with Seth Meyers or, whatever the show is. And if you go a little long or you say the wrong word, they can tape it. But for the most part, it is filmed in front of a live studio audience, or it can be if there isn't a pandemic. So there's only so much editing they can do. They don't have a lot of time. And also, once an audience hears something, it's kind of hard for them to forget you said it. And radio, for the most part, which I've done a lot of, and though you can see this also when you do TV, you're only allocated a certain amount of minutes in between commercials. So if you're only allocated a certain amount of minutes between commercials and you're interviewing someone, you really need to know the questions, and the person you're interviewing needs to know the answers, and everything really has to be tight. And sometimes that means that the interviewer is going to ask very simple questions, very direct questions. It means if you ever do those shows, you better answer quickly and sharply. And until you get very good at it on either end, it tends to end abruptly. Or if it doesn't end abruptly, it feels like here, let me do this with you. I'm gonna have a conversation with you right now, as if we were on a TV show or a radio interview show.
Okay.
And I'll say, so Randall, I hear you want to have some milk.
Yes, I want to have some milk. Where's the
What
milk?
kind of milk is your favorite milk?
It's the non-fat kind.
Non-fat is the best. Where do you normally get your milk from?
The grocery store.
Thank you so much, Randall. And we'll learn more about milk next time we have you on the show. See, that's what I'm saying. Like there is a tension in the conversation, and there is, even if it's done professionally, you may not notice it, but no one in real life is going to talk that way. Whereas let's talk about a show like, since we already brought it up, we'll talk about maybe WTF with Marc Maron, or Fresh Air with Terry Gross, or the Joe Rogan Show, right? What is that called? Is it just called the Joe Rogan Show?
I think it's the Joe Rogan Show, yeah.
Now, I do know that, Fresh Air really originated in radio. And I know that Marc Maron had a show similar to WTF when he was on Air America. So again, it comes out of a radio background. But to my knowledge, Joe Rogan, that's pure podcast.
Yeah, Joe Rogan started the show. Rogan's main innovation, I think, when he started was he was going to do an interview show, which is what a lot of podcasters do. But his main innovation was he was going to do a 3-hour or longer interview. And I'm surprised he even got guests, but he did. And that was brilliant because, just by doing that, he was able to go in depth and have actual conversations with people.
And also over the course of that much time, the mask falls off. I mean, you can only really have so many talking points.
Yes.
You can only be so guarded for so long. And then eventually you're going to break down and just expose your real self.
Well, I have seen interviews on Joe Rogan's show. I think it's called the Joe Rogan Experience, actually, maybe. But anyway, I have seen interviews he's done where somebody tries to be guarded the whole time. And after a while, you just realize that they're not being responsive and they are being guarded. So they get, even if they don't expose anything, they expose themselves by not exposing themselves. But you can only do that because of the time afforded.
And it's interesting because, Marc Maron is a variation on that. He's not like Joe Rogan, I would argue, but his show tends to run about an hour. And he will not just ask questions of people, but he has no problem talking about himself and exposing a lot of his own feelings, his own thoughts, so that when he's having a conversation, he is really trying to relate his own life experience to the people he's interviewing, so that in the course of a better Marc Maron interview, you learn something about himself while you're also learning about the person who's being interviewed. And sometimes that really draws out a very interesting interview. Sometimes the interview is less a traditional interview where you're learning about the history of a performer or an experience, and you get more into like, how does a performer feel about getting old? Or how does a performer feel about death? Or how the two of them might commiserate over having both started out in stand-up and having different friends in common. And in doing so, the better shows really feel like two people who are either good friends or people who have just come from the same experience, sitting down over a coffee or a beer and just hashing it out.
Yeah, I think the main innovation with Marc Maron is, I've listened to a lot of comedy podcasts, that is podcasts done by comedians. And they're trying to like riff like for a whole hour, even if they have guests on. And Marc Maron, from the start, he wasn't trying to be funny. He wasn't trying to riff. He wasn't trying to get them to do their material, run their material in the interview. He was asking them actual questions, having actual conversation, which, you know what? I think that was actually pretty novel at the time. Maybe it's still pretty novel, where you have a comedian and you just ask them actual real questions. You have a real conversation with a comedian instead of having them just do their material.
But on the other hand, I like it when he has someone like a Frank Langella or a Joe Pesci or Joe Pantalone come in who is just a dynamic energy. And instead of trying to fight the guy, just let him go at his own speed. You know, if he wants to come in and reminisce about his youth, talk about the biggest mistakes he made as a young man, or about how he auditioned for something, it's exciting because he won't stop the natural energy that the interviewee has, you know. And those are some great episodes because he's just along for the ride. He is willing, and I don't know if this is by choice or just by the fact that maybe this is true for Joe Rogan. I don't really listen to Joe Rogan, but even the faults of Marc Maron, his own shortcomings, you start seeing his jealousies and his pettiness and his cluelessness. And you don't, because he's a well-intentioned person, you don't dislike him for it, but you also see, like, we're so used to interviewers hiding enough of themselves that you don't see their weaknesses, that to see him with his own vulnerabilities. Look, he lost his girlfriend this past year, and there's certain episodes where it just starts to kind of overwhelm him during the interview, and he doesn't stop the interview, he just works through it. And you know, a lot of people have, certainly some people have lost people during COVID, and a lot of people are losing people. It's just part of life. So to watch someone just be unguarded and open about their humanity, especially during a crisis like this, I think can be very effective. And then you look at someone like Terry Gross, who has been doing Fresh Air on radio for years, and is I would argue, one of the most traditional public television, public radio interviewers ever, because, you know, I guess Dick Cavett is the one who started it, but you have the interviewer who is well-read, very thoughtful, very introspective, who asks really deep and probing questions, but will give the interviewee as much time as they need in this format to really explain and offer what they want to say, and then just drill it down further. What do you feel? Do you feel that Terry Gross has changed since her show went from being a main staple of radio to being a main staple of podcasting?
You know, I don't listen to her show that much. I'm not really a huge fan of Terry Gross. I'm not. I feel she's a little bit too much of a mainstream interviewer, like you're saying. She has guests on her show that are trying to promote a project, and then she
that's
asks them
true
about
for
the
Marc
project.
Maron as well. I mean, these are booked hosts, guests, so they're almost always there to promote.
Right.
But my point
you want to
is
get, but you want to get past that, and I don't know if
I don't think
Gross
so,
gets
because
that far
I mean,
past that.
Marc Maron, we've just praised. That's all he does now, is just get people who've got something to promote. Maybe Joe Rogan doesn't. I don't know. Again, I don't watch Joe Rogan. I don't vibe with Joe Rogan. I'm not saying he's bad. I'm just saying I'm not into 3-hour podcasts. But I will say very subtly, I do feel that she has grown as an interviewer because she is working in a different format. So we've talked kind of about interview shows, but the other thing that I feel, if we look at it, it looks a lot like magazines and newspapers, right? Like podcasts in a way now have become like a source for news and information, which has never been more necessary again. But during a pandemic and an election year, and also George Floyd. I mean, we had so many things going on that required reportage. And I think what's happened here is that TV news is really about chasing the headline. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, sure. That's what all news is about. It's about the story.
But TV news more and more over the last couple of years has been less about going in deep and more built on either two things. If you watch news today, not read news, but you watch news today, it's either about what are the top 5 breaking stories, or it's talking heads, right? Opining on.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. TV news has definitely, it's definitely concerned with what's going on in the moment, what's going on right, absolutely at this moment.
It's not big on context.
You don't ever get beyond that.
Yeah, it's not big on context. You know, you don't really, things are happening, but you don't really ask the bigger questions like the why and the how. It's all just the bold part. And even the people who are on these shows offering their opinion, just like the interviewees, they're kind of stuck in that very tight corner of you only have a couple of seconds every minute to volley before it's time for the commercial. So what you're seeing now, and it's interesting too, because network shows have a more mainstream tilt, right? So the kinds of people that you'll see are much more establishment people. But on podcasts, like, I don't like Pod Save America, but it's certainly one of the most popular. I don't like it. I just don't like these guys. But it's very popular. And that is a show where you have people who would not traditionally be in the podcasting world, even though they did mostly work for the Obama administration, going in deeper. You have the New York Times has one that goes in much deeper.
Yeah, I want to say that,
like Young Turks, and go on.
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, the talking head stuff, I do like it. I mean, because like you're saying, you can get a little bit more nuance. You can go a little bit more in depth in these stories. Bill Maher's show on HBO is a good example of that.
But imagine if Bill Maher had a podcast.
Yes, it would probably be great. But his show on HBO is almost like a podcast.
Well, but his show is limited. But the problem is his show is limited by the constraints of time. And that like if you listen to Bill Burr's Monday show, that is not limited by the constraints of time. And I believe Bill Maher just did a WTF. I'm really looking forward to listening to that. But what was the point I was going to make with you? Which is that, so you really have two things. You have opinion, right? It is much easier to do an opinion podcast. This show, in many ways, is simply an opinion show about arts and entertainment. You and I are offering our opinions, and like a news program, we're offering information in detail. So what you're really getting when you listen to our show is a little bit of detail, some analysis, some facts, and a shit ton of opinion.
Right. But I just want to say that's what's good about, there's the advantage of having somebody who's educated and they're knowledgeable about the field, about the subject, they have experience with the subject, offer their opinion, is you get like a perspective on the situation, without. So this is why the talking heads can be interesting because, if you just look at certain stories or certain things happening just from like the outside, you just look at the facts of the situation. There's a lot of context you're missing that somebody who is more knowledgeable of the field has. That that unless you hear their opinion, you don't really get a full perspective. I mean,
and I think what you're saying is actually something that really we should build on, because if you're really talking about, when we say talking heads, we're really saying as experts, right? And podcast shows are great for bringing on people who have expertise in an area and giving them the necessary amount of time they need to really expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel personally that I learn a lot about a subject, about a field, when I hear an expert, and I'll just say an expert is somebody with a lot of experience in that field. When I hear somebody like that talk about that field or talk about an incident that happened in that field, then I feel like I learn a lot about it. I feel like I learn way more than if I just read like the dry facts.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing. Certainly the New York Times does one where it doesn't, I think in general, a lot of the podcasts are not trying to be up to the minute. They may be up to the week, they may be up to the month, they may be up to the moment, but they also might go backwards. And you're right, sometimes it's just an expert with heavy credentials, or it's a dedicated amateur who's done their own homework. What is that show called? Hardcore History?
Oh yeah, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. That's a great show. That's a fun show. I think.
Want to explain what the show's about? Because technically now we're getting more into the information show versus a news show where you're learning facts and interesting stuff about stuff.
Well, I just want to say, well, okay, I'll just give my opinion on like what Dan Carlin's doing. There's this certain way And maybe this is exactly what we're talking about. There's a certain way, it's good that you bring it up. There's a certain way that people have traditionally looked at history, is they look at it by just trying to sort it into different facts and events, and they don't have a deeper analysis. And I think that the whole reason that's done is because they're trying to take the politics out of history. And I don't think there is a way to take politics out of history. Politics, in my opinion, is just new history, and history is just old politics. And so somebody like a Dan Carlin goes back, and he's putting the politics back into history. He's putting the cause and effect back into history. And sure, some of the things he says are probably opinion, okay, but you can't analyze reality without some opinions. I mean, if you just look at reality as a set of facts, then you're missing a big picture, I feel. And Carlin is able to do that, go back at history. If you just look at history as just like not as a narrative, it's just a series of events that are completely unrelated, then what's the point? And nothing makes any sense. There's no reason to even look at it. It's just a box full of unrelated toys.
And the thing about Carlin is he's not, to my knowledge, a professor of history. He's well educated and well read, but he is in some ways an amateur in that he's not a credentialed professor teaching anywhere. But on the other hand, he has an opinion, he is an enthusiast, and he knows how to take a subject and make it very entertaining. A really other great example of this is somebody that everybody really likes is Malcolm Gladwell, who one of my favorite podcasts that he does is called Hidden Brain, where he takes case studies and it has a story, and he goes into depth about what's going on in the story. Then he talks to experts to elucidate on the story, and it all feeds a central theme about how the brain works. And he does a lot of different podcasts. And I'll just say right now, if you ever see the words Malcolm Gladwell in podcast, whatever it is, listen to it. But it's really interesting. Him, most of us know him for his wonderful nonfiction books like Blink and The Tipping Point. He just put out a new book. I think it's called Talking to Strangers. And it's a good book. But he also put out an audiobook. All of his works have been put out into audiobooks. But he said he learned so much from podcasting that when he put out the audiobook, instead of having him just straight up read the chapters, he is using the same tricks like recordings, interviews, lots of second audio, lots of primary source material, even sound effects and music, so that if you listen to a chapter, and there's a free chapter called Queen of Cuba, which you can find, and it's a free chapter. And if you listen to it, it sounds indistinguishable from a podcast. And it's interesting to watch how, I would argue, at least in nonfiction, the podcast is really changing the way we see both audiobooks and the way we see documentary, especially TV documentary.
Well, I gotta say that listening to books is like my preferred way of reading a book now. Yeah. I mean, you can listen to a book and do the dishes, drive your car. It's great.
And it's weird because there was a slight dip in audiobook sales last year because, again, people aren't in cars. But at the same time, I would imagine that as the two formats merge, the BBC, which started in the 70s with radio dramas like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and in the 80s, Star Wars, and all sorts of great stuff. Big Finish is a production company that does Doctor Who in England. They're now getting into scripted podcasts. It's not something I have any experience with. I know a number of people put them out, but that is a whole other area in which we can start seeing, podcasts really start. It's like bringing back the old 1930s, 1940 radio plays.
Yeah, and I think they're. I think it's the podcast that really is making them think they can do this. Yeah. Because if they were just throwing this stuff on radio, no one would care, but now that they can put it on a podcast, you can download the whole show, you can download the whole story, you can listen to it all at your leisure. I mean, it makes total sense.
So in many ways, the podcast is revitalizing things that were dying in radio, or revitalizing the audiobook to something more than just a person reading a book. And I even think to myself, because I've been watching Alan v. Farrow on HBO, and it's one of the many documentaries that you see on HBO that also come with a supportive podcast. Actually, even the scripted works on HBO and other shows now, like Walking Dead has one called Talking Dead. And the idea of podcasts as supplementary materials to shows you watch, either to cover facts that they didn't have time on the show and do a deeper dive, or just to get the people who are part of the show to talk more about the process of the show.
Well, so you watched the HBO documentary and then you listen to the podcast?
Yes, and there's a podcast for each episode so that you get more background information that they can cover, because again, there's only so much you can cover in a 1 hour episode on HBO in a documentary.
Okay.
You add another hour of a podcast, or an hour and 15 minutes.
All right. So that's interesting. I didn't know that. So would you say, so the podcast just expanded on each episode?
The podcast on most documentaries I've watched tends to expand and provide even more background, more context, because even in TV, just like in film, but they're, they only have 4 hours to tell this story.
Well, yeah. Well, I just want to say,
from working a documentary, you're always trying to cut things down, but there's things that you cut. The more you cut, the less context you have.
Yeah, if you're working with distributors with a documentary, the distributors are going to be demanding certain time limits, and video content is way more expensive than audio content. So, that's another advantage of podcasting. I guess I don't know if we touched on, but podcasting can be very inexpensive in comparison to other types of media. I mean, maybe even it's more cheaper than writing even.
Well, we'll talk about that in just a moment, because I want to get into the economics very soon. But I think what I've really been trying to set us up to is fascinating to me is, I think the thing that is really that seems super popular in podcasts, and not really in the various forms that we've talked about up until now, except for one form of fiction, not fiction, except for in the world of publishing. I can't think of another area where true crime is as popular as it is in podcasts. So why do you think it is that true crime is so dominant in podcasting? Why so much true crime?
Well, I can just off the top of my head, I can think of a couple reasons. I mean, I think it's possible that maybe, women like true crime. Maybe there's a lot of women that prefer audio content. I think a lot of true crime, it lends itself more to a longer format. It's like a lot of crimes. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the crime. There's a lot of background information, and the podcast without the time limits, you can really put it all in there.
As a man who likes true crime, I will definitely say one of the things that I think that is the appeal for me in the podcast format is, in some ways, it does remind me of listening to radio. It does remind me of the news. There's a certain kind of factual nature, but maybe because I'm hearing it more than seeing it, there's something inherently creepy about hearing about a true crime more than watching a true crime.
Yeah,
there's less of a separation.
You can imagine the events in your head. I could totally see that. I never thought of that, but I could see that.
And it's interesting because I would argue that true crime on TV is like Nightline and what's that one with Chris Hansen where he's always To Catch a Predator?
To Catch a Predator.
It's very salacious and very cheap. Or true crime in documentary filmmaking is often much more remote and abstract, But when you get to like the podcast, what's really nice about it is that it's neither salacious nor is it too abstract. It's very interesting to now watch. And again, you see it again on the streaming services that we're doing true crime or like I was watching McMillions on HBO, and I think there's been a few other documentaries on the other services, but you can really see how even documentaries in general now are being influenced by podcast true crime.
I can totally
out the information.
Yeah, I mean, before podcasting, when people did true crime on TV, you definitely did not get all the facts. They would
Yeah.
have to leave a lot of stuff out. And then the internet came, and people started writing about true crime on the internet, and you get a lot more of the facts, but there wasn't. It was mostly done by amateurs, who didn't have a lot of time to work on these projects. And now with podcasting, you have like, I guess we'll say professional podcasters who are trying to tell the stories of these crimes, and they have the time and the resources to go ahead and throw everything in there. And yeah, I mean, I've listened to I think I listened to Dirty John, the podcast, and
Yeah.
these true crime podcasts, they're comprehensive, and they're doing a great job of that. And they should be. I mean, it's a great format for
And
that.
it is, and it makes us more. We don't want to commit crimes. Another really popular format. I know that's my segue, folks. I didn't go to podcast school. That's another thing. There is no podcast school. Maybe now there is, but not in my day. Back in 2015, there's a lot of celebrity hosted podcasts, and I'm not just saying like talk shows, but like there are things with Dax Shepard where he interviews interesting non-celebrities. There's a show with Jason Bateman, Will Arnett, and Sean Hayes, where they talk to very smart people who are not famous. There is Anna Faris has her own show. A lot of different celebrities doing what I would say is not celebrity things with their show. To me, the most interesting, is kind of a weird one, is Angela Kinsey and Jenna Fischer do a show called Office Girls, where they just review episodes of The Office that they were in. Like,
Have you listened? You listen to that?
yeah, I listen to all of the things I just mentioned, and I would say the one unifying factor in all of these is that once you put a famous actor or comic, and that's really what we're talking about. Mostly they're actors and comic or talk show hosts like Conan O'Brien. Conan Needs a Friend. Once you put them in a podcast, there is something much more informal and more relaxed, and you do feel like you are seeing them in a different way.
Well, I'll say, yeah, about a lot of these shows is there's not a lot of editing, which I think is to their advantage, because you get to hear the actual person. When they show interviews on TV, most of the time they're heavily edited, and they try to hide the cuts. With all they hide the cuts, but in this podcast format, nobody wants to spend a lot of time editing their podcast. So you hear like somebody for an hour straight, and yeah, you really get to know. I think I said this in another show. I don't know what we're talking about, but you really get to get a real feel for the whole person if you listen to them talk for an hour.
Especially in a year where most of these people, what they do for a living is on hold. So you have a lot of actors and interviewers who cannot act and cannot interview, and they're just sitting in the house waiting for Instacart to arrive and trying not to die. And they're not wearing their nicest clothing. They haven't had a haircut. Their house is not a studio. So all the things that have given them so much of an identity to lean into has been stripped away. And you're just kind of meeting them in a very raw, very honest space. And I think that the sound of someone's voice or a camera, like, look at me right now. I haven't had a haircut since October. I don't want to. I want to get a haircut. But you're looking at a man who's very much part of the world that you're living in right now. And I think that causes a bonding. And I think that's why people are really enjoying watching celebrities go out of their comfort zone, doing something different, because we are all, in a way, going out of our comfort zone and doing something different. Wouldn't you say so, Randall?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I need to go more out of my comfort zone, but
Yeah. Well, no,
we are just sitting in our apartments right now.
we're sitting in our apartment, no makeup. Neither of us wear makeup. I'd like some makeup and a wardrobe assistant, but like a whole other different question is like one of my favorite podcasts is a show called Scriptnotes. And on Scriptnotes, all they do is Craig Zadan, who wrote Chernobyl, and I forgot the other guy. They just talk other screenwriters, and they go like page by page, beat by beat. I mean, they just drill down so hard. And if you're like me or you and you want to be a better screenwriter, oh my God, we're revealing ourselves. Uh, it's a brilliant show to watch because it's like a master class in screenwriting. It's actually better than master class's own screenwriting program, which I have.
Well, this is exactly what
I'd recommend it to my mom. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just not a very good show unless you're if you have like, they use words that if you're not in screenwriting, you're not gonna, what are they talking about?
Right.
So, and then there's other shows, you know, like I like the one I just mentioned, the New York Times, where they'll just talk about, you know, an issue of the day, like George Floyd, or there'll be a show, you know, where Conan O'Brien is just yucking it up with Anna Faris. So my question to you is, do you think podcasts are a better medium for generalists, people who just want to know a little bit about actually want to know a little bit of everything, like a show that this week will cover the Roman Empire? Like, okay, so sorry. And this is what we're not editing, because look at what I'm doing. I'm making a mistake, and I'm just going to reframe what I want to say. What I want to say is as follows. You have a show like Scriptnotes, and Scriptnotes just is for screenwriters. Then you have one of those things like Hidden Brain, which weirdly enough is a generalist show because each episode covers different things, and depending on your interests, or How We Made That, which is a show about how things are done, or a show about how people start a business, they're for generalists if you want to know a little bit about something. So do you think the podcast is a medium better off for people who just want to get all the way drilling down like a warthog? Or do you think it's better for the fox who wants to just skip around?
Well, I mean, I guess for the listener, it's better for your generalist because there's like so much different stuff you could look into. But for the podcaster, it might be better to be a specialist in something. You know, Joe Rogan, he is a generalist, but he is a stand-in for his audience. You know, so when he has somebody on his show who's an expert in an area, he can really drill down and understand their expertise and their experience in that area. So this is what we were talking about before when it comes to experts. Yeah. So
are there any favorite podcasts that besides Joe Rogan that you failed to mention you want to just recommend?
Well, you know, I love Radiolab. I love This American Life. What else do I like? I can't think of any right now, any more than that. There's a few podcasts I've listened to. I mean, I you know what? I tend to not subscribe to podcasts. Oh, Freakonomics. I love the Freakonomics podcast too. I tend to not subscribe. I tend to like go to podcast websites and look for episodes that sound interesting and then just listen to those. That's generally what I do with podcasts.
Me too. I tend to do that. That's so funny. I do that as well. I cherry pick everything, even WTF. I'll just listen to. I like this show called Working It Out with Mike Birbiglia, who's a comic and a storyteller, and he interviews people. But I like what he does because he's not an a-hole like Joe Rogan and the other two people I forgot to mention. Marc Maron's an a-hole in a way, and even Terry Gross is a bit clueless. Whereas I like Mike Birbiglia because he doesn't attempt to be the smartest person in the room. And he does ask people like, what are you working on? And can I help you? And here's what I'm working on creatively. And maybe you can help me. And he only picks people who genuinely interest him, which is different. He doesn't pick people who are there to promote anything. He literally only will do the show when he feels like it. And then the conversations are always between people that he really has affection for. So I like that show a lot. I do like both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and NPR all put out shows that are basically an in-depth 30-minute look at what's going on in the world in one particular article. And Scriptnotes is great if you're into screenwriting. There are really, I would say, use Spotify. You know what I'm saying? Storytelling. Hey, folks, if you like storytelling, I know a number of really good storytelling podcasts, including Storyworthy by Christine Blackburn, where she interviews people to tell stories and she asks backgrounds on the story. She also does a show called Story Smash, which is a storytelling game show, which she puts out in podcast form. Who else? What else? There's lots of really good. I've done podcasts, and well, there's our podcast. So let's talk about us, Randall. What inspired us? What? How did we get here, Randall?
I think it was.
We get here a year later of our lives. What the hell are we doing? Whose dumb idea was it to even do? Oh, it was your idea to do.
I think it was my idea. Well, it was because COVID hit, and we had always talked about doing a podcast. We recorded some episodes of another one years ago where we tried to do it,
which we shall never speak about, because all we did was we just sit in front of a mic. I'd look at you and you look at me, and then we would proceed to get drunk.
I didn't think it was that bad, but yeah, it was different. It was a different format.
Through a lot of things. I was 49, and who knows? Maybe
you were single. You were a single man back then.
Single, angry, sad man with a lot on his mind. You know, I guess when I want to tank my career, or when you want to blackmail me, that's
there's no. I've listened to them. There's nothing bad on there. Yeah. I guess COVID hit, and you know, I usually work as a photographer, videographer. And I usually recorded live shows in theaters. So like that whole, like half of what I used to do is gone. I mean, I have a day job as a lifeguard, which went away also for a time. It's back now, but so I had a lot of time on my hands, and you know, I had already set up a lot of the infrastructure you need for podcasting. I mean, this is a real podcast, by the way. I mean, some people do what they call a podcast, but really they're just posting to YouTube or something. So we have a real podcast, and you know, I had already set up the infrastructure, so I just had some time, and and also Zoom. You know, I mean, I had started using Zoom. You know, I don't know when Zoom came around. Like, it's relatively new, and Zoom really allows you to do a podcast fairly easily. I mean.
I would say that when you first said to me, "Hey, let's do a podcast," I was very hesitant. I didn't feel that the last time we did a podcast, it was an experience I wanted to share with the world. I didn't want to do it. I was kind of freaked out by the pandemic. So, you know, I too had a day job. It got slammed working as a bartender in a theater. It's still, thank you, EDD, for underwriting this show. It really is one of our sponsors, unemployment.
The state of California.
The state of California, thank you. One of our sponsors. If you're unemployed, don't forget the state of California's want to live. Anyway, what was I going to say? So I like you. I'm a performer. I had no stage to do storytelling in. I didn't really feel like writing for a medium that I couldn't get in. I couldn't get on a stage. Why write a screenplay if no one can go to the movie? So this show is based on, Randall and I used to go to Soup Plantation, which doesn't exist thanks to COVID. And we'd have these great conversations about art and entertainment. And this show is really basically us having a conversation about art and entertainment, except we're no longer at Soup Plantation. It's gone. We're no longer sitting next to each other drinking coffee or beer, thanks to you. Well, we both got vaccinated. So, Randall, I really hope to one day sit in the studio with you. So that's what inspired us. And it's weird because what inspires you isn't always what you end up doing. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, since you've already talked about the fact we're a professional podcast, so you handled this part. You got us on all these various platforms.
Yeah,
right?
If anybody's interested, I do all the technical stuff.
So how did you get us, like if someone is listening and they want to start their own podcast, like what were the things on the technical end that you had to do to set us up?
Well, if you're going to do like a real podcast, quote unquote, you're going to need a hosting service. I mean, you could host it on, you can make a website, host it on your own website, but you're going to need a place to host the episodes, which is what I'd recommend. You don't want to do that yourself. It's too much work. And there's really, I think there's only actually 2 websites in the entire world that actually do that, host podcasts. And one is Burberry and the other one is Libsyn. And we're on Libsyn. And So you have to get an account on Libsyn. You got to upload your episodes to Libsyn. And then also, on top of that, I decided that since we're using Zoom, we could do a video portion of our podcast as well. So I just independently upload each episode to YouTube and Facebook as well. And that's it. So, I mean, to have like a real podcast, you need to have you need to subscribe to one of those hosting services. I mean, technically, because you want an RSS feed and you want that
not a heavy
to go
barrier of entry for people.
No, it's not.
I will say how we come up with our show. So every week, we come up with a new topic. Well, that's not true. Some weeks are just part 2 or part 3 or part 4. But normally the way it works is Randall and I will have a discussion, often right after we're done recording, where we'll pitch ideas to each other. And then one of us will go online and start doing research, and then we'll call each other and we'll hash it out. And then I'll write some stuff and he'll write some stuff. And then we'll come up with these things called talking points, where we literally outline the conversation we're going to have, and we follow that to a degree. And then we get off script because nothing is ever exactly the way you planned it. Sometimes if the show goes really long, we'll break it into 2 episodes. And then we promote the show. Randall, how do we promote the show? You are also the guy promoting us. So
I haven't put a lot into promoting it. I've spent some money on advertising on Facebook.
Thanks.
Well,
that's the thing. It's kind of organic. So one of the things that we think about when we promote the show, when we come up with ideas for the show, is we really give a lot of thought of who our audience is. And this is why I always ask you to comment and share and give us your opinion, because the people who have commented and shared are people who have helped shape the show. We came into this with no idea of who was going to listen to us, what makes us, who's our audience. So I can say right now, not forever, but right now, it really seems like the people who are the most ardent about listening to the show are people who are roughly around our own age, people who are anywhere from their early 40s to their late 50s, people who came of age in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, people who like rock music, people who like punk rock, people like movies, people who like, for the most part, I'd say traditional media. Most of the people who are like our age grew up back in the day where there was HBO was considered kind of groundbreaking. All of us may have iPhones or some kind of smartphone, but we're not living our whole lives on the internet. What do you think about our audience? I think about them a lot when we put these shows together. Do you?
No, because no, I don't think about the audience. I just, I try to treat myself as the audience, and I try to do what I would want to hear, what I would want to do. I mean, I feel like we're trying to make a show that treats art seriously, and I think that's rather novel. I mean, I don't know if there's other shows like ours actually, but
I don't know. I mean, I definitely think about myself. Obviously, you've got to do it for yourself, or why do it at all? But I do think that our audience and ourselves are not that dissimilar, and that's okay. What have you learned in this year of podcasting our show? What are the big revelations that you or one at least? What's the takeaway? What is something you discovered?
What have I discovered? It's a lot harder work than I thought it would be to do a podcast. I mean, it would probably be easier if I didn't do the video portion of our podcast. But yeah, I mean, I have to record every show, and then I have to listen to it to make, if I need to cut anything out, which don't always have to edit, but I mean, the tops and bottoms at least have to be edited. There has to be some kind of editing that has to be rendered out. I mean, I kind of, when I first started, I envisioned doing this podcast as something that wouldn't be time consuming. I mean, that was the main thing. I wanted to make something that was quick and easy, quick and easy content. That's the dream. Anybody that makes content, that's always the dream. You want to make content.
It's a crack dream. Okay. I'm just telling you whoa, that's like trying to be famous doing this. Another thing, you're not going to get famous doing a podcast unless you're one of 5 people in America. But go on. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Right. Well, I wanted to make content that was just easy to make and quick, and it's a lot of work. I mean, you have to, at the very least, I think. I mean, maybe you don't have to, but if it's you, but you should listen to it before you put it out. I mean, just to make sure it sounds right. I mean, I do a lot of I do some degree of post production on these podcasts. Okay, I run it through like a sound leveler to level the volume, to normalize it everywhere, and then and the video portion I color correct it, and and I have to the side by side. I mean, I do that like by hand in post. I mean, there are some tools out there that allow you to like do that more easily, but none of them are very good. I mean, yeah. So this has been a lot of work.
Yeah, I hear you. What have I learned? Thanks for asking. I have learned, I've learned to always listen to every episode of the show or watch every episode of the show. Try to watch or listen to the show with someone else. If you've got having friends who do, thank you, friends. I'll ask them for their honest opinion, and sometimes the opinions aren't so great. But learning to take criticism and learning how to adapt only makes the show better, and that is certainly something I've learned, is to be more personal about our lives, as it's not just a show about arts and entertainment, but also, our relationship to the subject is one thing I've really learned. And if anything, the more personal, almost always the better. I think the best shows we've done really have been the ones where we can kind of draw the line. Like when we talked about candy or Halloween, it was great because we're really not just talking about candy and Halloween. We're talking about ourselves. When we talk about growing up and growing old with music, we're not just talking about music, we're talking about ourselves. And sometimes we've done shows where that just wasn't even the case. Like, I'm really proud of the interview show we did your brother on NFT art. Even though it really didn't say much about us personally, I didn't really know anything about NFT art. So just to do a show where I am learning stuff is so cool. I did like interviewing your brother, and I definitely think that in the future, we should interview more people, and we should do more shows that explain things that we don't even understand.
Should we put the word out? If you want to be on our show, give us a message.
As long as you've got something to contribute to the world of arts and entertainment.
Tell us what you want to say, what you want to talk about, what your subject is,
and we will we'll try to make it happen. So where do you see the future of our show going? I see us doing more and interesting things, spanning on the theme of art and entertainment, sharing both our views and opinions and ourselves.
Well, before I get to that, just let me say that one thing that surprised me about the show is I feel like we've done some fairly opinionated shows, right? I mean, would you agree with that?
Oh, hell yeah. We our Bernie Sanders Mitten show, Donald Trump is a stand-up comic, just to name a few.
Well, the thing that surprised me is we don't get much people, I don't know, talking about our opinions, telling us how we're wrong. I don't get that very much. I mean, it's
I don't either. I'm surprised. Either everyone agrees with us or no one agrees with us.
Everybody agrees with us.
I'm going to just assume that everybody is agreeing with us. All right, please, if you disagree, I want to hear it. I want to get into a fight with somebody who's like, how dare you and compare our president to a stand-up comic?
Just so everybody knows, I have never ever deleted a comment that wasn't spam. Like if it was spam, I've deleted spam, but everything else I've left. So
so we're trying to incense you. We are very liberal people. We don't hide our politics. We don't hide our point of view. We like you, but we don't need you to agree with us. So any
what was
final
the question?
Thoughts?
So your question was
any final thoughts about the future that you wanted to share with the listeners and viewers today?
Well, I mean, this has been some journey, right? This show. I mean, we've basically done all these different subjects. I mean, we've cast a huge net out there. I mean, I think that's good though. It's a good foundation. I mean, we can do even wilder subjects in the future, I hope.
Do things we never thought we were going to do find whole other areas that we wanted to explore. I know in the year to come, we are going to only further expand how art and entertainment interact and shape our society, and how art and entertainment reveal something not just about the human condition in the general sense, but about our own personal condition. In doing so, I guess we will learn not just about art and entertainment, but we'll also learn about ourselves in relationship to arts and entertainment. So thank you for this journey. Thank you for the year. Happy birthday to you, Randall, and me and our show. And thank you all for listening. And until next time, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.